It's 1 o'clock on the West Coast, which we welcome you to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with my colleague and co-host, Edgar Zazweta, ACSA's Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. We want to welcome you to the show. We want to remind you this is a live and interactive show. We welcome your questions and your comments. Make sure you say hello to us from wherever you're watching today. We've got a very, very big show today. We've got a lot of news to cover. We also have Ryan Smith from the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. He'll be on the show a little bit later on to talk about distance learning, to talk about some of the social issues and how we talk about those in schools. But Edgar, we're 2.5 days into this week, a whole lot of news that's come out. I know that there's a lot to talk about with the waiver process. We have some information in today from the SPI about a collaboration with Apple and T-Mobile to connect 1 million students in need with discounted iPads that are already equipped with high-speed internet. That is good news as we move into the school year. But I do want to ask you nuts and bolts right now of the waiver situation, because that's the big story that's happening right now.
Naj, good to see you. Wouldn't want to be any other place on Wednesdays at 1 than here virtually with you. So good to see you again, my friend. Yeah, like you said, every week, I feel for a number of weeks, we were talking about first the guidance, then the waivers. I know the waivers has gotten a ton of attention over the last week. I think partly because a lot of parents, a lot of families, there was some disappointment in general why everybody was concerned about the health and safety of obviously students and staff when they realized that there was potentially a pathway for elementary schools to open, even if you're on the even if your county is on the monitoring list, and per the new state guidelines, you have to open per distance learning, and you're not allowed to have in-person instruction. There was an exception potentially for elementary schools. And so what we learned in the last couple of days, the governor's office and California Department of Public Health formally released their guidelines, kind of protocols for this waiver, and we learned a few things. So as we've been telling folks, it is going to be very much a local process. They're asking folks to go, the superintendent or equivalent. So if you're in a charter school, the equivalent of the superintendent, or the private school, whoever the local education agency, whoever the head is, has to submit a waiver to their local county health officer and basically do a few things. They have to have evidence that they've consulted with their labor groups. If they don't have bargaining units in their particular district or LEA, then their equivalent, so their parents staff and parents. So with parents and community groups, there's also some requirements that you check in with them. Then you submit it to your local county health office. They're supposed to consult with the state, with CDPH, and they're pretty aggressive in terms of saying that once it gets to CDPH, they're supposed to hear back within 72 hours, I believe it is, 3 days. The idea there is that these waivers be submitted at least 14 days prior to the district even thinking about opening up, and you have to publicize it on your website. So there's a number of requirements there, but there's a lot of devil in the details. But I think that, generally speaking, is kind of the process.
Yeah, and Cheryl Quinones, good to have you on the show today. You mentioned labor. And I want to pull a couple of quotes out here from a story that was published yesterday at about, can't even find the time it was published, but so California's 2 teacher unions blasting this waiver process, calling it reckless and unfair. Leaders of the CTA, of CFT, they're demanding the state shut what they're calling a side door for certain elementary schools, public or private, to reopen with approval from the state. Local public health officials, they're talking about some equity issues that are involved in there. What is the response right now that you have heard coming from members? You and I talk to the superintendents and the site and the district administrators all the time. What are you hearing specifically from the members right now as far as this waiver is concerned?
Yeah, it's interesting because in the weeks since it even got announced that there was going to be a waiver process, I think the the reaction from our members, from superintendents, from other folks in the field, had been somewhat muted, and I think it was anticipating some of what you just read off in our reaction from our labor partners, that even though there was a pathway, getting our bargaining units, our folks to to sign on, or even have some level of buy-in into this process was a level of concern. So I think it just depends. There's so many things with this pandemic. It really depends on what community you're in. What we're hearing is in some communities that there is a pathway, and they think that they can get their bargaining units to sign on, or if not sign on, at least that they consult with them and say, this is why we're moving in this direction. But there's a lot of concern around the state of, is it even worth going through the process if you're not able to get your unions, your teachers, your other employees to have that level of buy-in to make this a reality. So I think it's being met with mixed reaction. I think there's a ton of headline. You just read any paper here in the last couple of days, it's one of the top stories. And I think that's kind of a result of, again, this parent sentiment. I think the reality now of this process of who's actually going to get approved is a little bit more muted. And then that's not to mention the health situation. In some communities, I believe in LA County, the health officer actually said that they're not going to approve any waivers right now because the rates are so high, that they'll reconsider that moving down the line. But at this point, they don't believe that that's the best route to go.
Yeah, boy, there's certainly a lot about this entire topic, and we want to let our viewers know we may end up coming back to this topic. In fact, if we have questions and comments, Edgar, we will come back to this topic near the bottom of the hour. So if you have questions or comments or concerns about the waiver process, make sure to stay with us through the rest of the show, and text any of your education colleagues that may also have questions or comments about this topic, because we're definitely going to come back to it. Gary and Deborah, we want to thank you guys, and Gail Olson for joining in. Folks, let's go ahead and let's move to another important topic right now. We'll bring in our guest. He's a longtime equity champion from the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. Ryan Smith is with us today. It's an honor to have you, Ryan. Thanks so much for being with us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. I want to come and qualify this right off the top, because some people outside of Los Angeles may not be familiar with the work you are doing and your team is doing with the partnership. Can you just give us some background and some details on what that work is?
Yeah. So Naj, Edgar, it's good to see you. I know that we've talked in my previous role at Trust West. Happy to talk to you right now at the partnership. So the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools is an organization that supports 19 traditional public schools within LAUSD. You think of us as the innovation arm of the district, particularly supporting historically under-resourced schools in Watts and Boyle Heights in South LA. We are not a charter management organization. We are really about how do we bring resource equity and educational equity to the highest need schools in the district, and we're happy to do so, and we've done so for the last decade. So we are certainly thinking about school reopenings. We're certainly thinking about issues of equity right now for our students that matter the most, and I'm happy to join you to talk a little bit more about this.
Ryan, good to see you. A longtime partner, I know, in our work when we were both in Los Angeles, and then you became a statewide leader. I mean, and I don't say this just because you're with us, but very few voices who are more consistent and strong on the issue of equity, on the issue of, as we're talking about, social justice. So just thank you for joining us, and thank you more for the work you do on behalf of kids. So we ask everybody, obviously it's hard not to have any conversation here as we're talking about reopening schools. So I'll start on that one. Kind of from your perspective, you've seen this systemically, you know, obviously from some of your statewide work. Obviously you're looking at a very important community right now in Los Angeles. But what have we learned, and what did we learn in terms from the spring and from the experiences that we had as a state and as in your community, and how is that going to change things here moving forward as you folks are opening up schools in the coming weeks?
Yeah, so we've been exploring this idea around punctuated equilibrium. I'm not sure if everyone knows that expression, but it's this evolutionary biology principle that that development is marked by long terms of isolated non-growth, and then there's this cataclysmic event that forces change. And I feel like we are in a punctuated equilibrium moment. I think we learned very quickly that systems that we thought could not pivot quickly can. I will actually applaud Los Angeles and other communities across the state who were able to really think about the basic needs of students. We saw that we've moved quickly in many communities around how we provide technology to students and families. But I will say this, we have so much more work to do. Clearly, the digital divide is huge. And as hotspots are important, but thinking about infrastructure is very different. Any equity issues that we knew of were exacerbated at this point. And I feel for the families, whether it's Los Angeles or whether you're talking about Stockton, whether you're talking about Oakland, or whether you're talking about Sacramento, who may be dealing with food insecurity, housing insecurity, becoming even more essential as parents supporting their child's education and thinking about how we support students moving into the future. Now is really the time to think about how we both wrap around our services for students, as well as give them the quality education necessary for them to continue to succeed.
Well, Ryan, you mentioned a number of different pieces and topics there, whether it comes to nutrition or distance learning or acquisition of technology. And through your lens, what has the impact of COVID-19 been on the students? Not just those ones from the 19 schools you guys are with, but just in general.
Yeah, well, and I'll even say a little bit broader. I know we'll talk about issues of racial justice, but the students that we received or had in March are very different students that are coming back in the fall. Not only have they gone through a global pandemic, but they've also seen civil unrest and uprisings due to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others at the hands of police. So there's really, we really should be thinking about, one, how do we double down on relationships? If we're not having conversations around social emotional learning, we're not having conversations about how we make sure that because our students are in front of us, that we're really thinking about grounding conversations online and just getting to know where our students is important. And if there was ever a time to talk about student voice, and I went marching with Black Lives Matter, and I saw 14, 15, 16-year-old students marching with me. So if we're not talking about how we bring their agency and their voice into the classroom when we begin in the fall, then we're not meeting them where they're at. So I think we have to think differently about family engagement in this moment as well. I think it's amazing that parents are supporting their children in a way that maybe they've not done before. They become even more essential in their child's education. So I'm happy that as districts, we're giving out surveys and receiving that information. But how do we strengthen the relationship with parents? How do we ensure that they understand technology, that they understand what's happening with instruction, which I think is going to be really important and essential as well. Last but not least, I think we're talking about safety, clearly, and how we ensure the safety of our students. And that will continue to be a theme as we open in the fall.
Ryan, I know the partnership historically has been a leader in practices of engaging community, engaging parents, and the parent universities and other practices that really have shown others how to really operationalize some of the work you're talking about. And you hit on this, talking about the social injustice, the conversations about racial equity. As our viewers talked about, some of these conversations are happening amongst young people themselves. And now that we're starting school, even in this distance learning environment where we're not going to be connected physically, how should schools really seek to continue to engage the students and engage families for that matter?
Yeah, well, first I'll talk, since you mentioned kind of the racial justice moment, we're actually having a summer institute right now. So we do a professional development for a number of our teacher leaders across our network on how to think about the year coming up. And we're really having a summer institute steeped in anti-racism and its connection to equity and its connection to college readiness. So I think we need to have unapologetic conversations about the current state that we're dealing with, about how we have courageous conversations around race, class, how we support particularly African-American students, Latinx students, English learners, and other marginalized communities. I think that's going to be really important. So I'm excited about thinking about professional development opportunities. I think the other thing is we have to think about what we can do different as far as parent engagement. Edgar just mentioned a parent academy that we do. 10 years ago, I founded a parent college program that continues to this day that educates parents on their 3 R's, their rights, roles, responsibilities. We've taken that whole entire program, put it online, and we will be doing classes every month in these communities to really help parents understand how they can support their child's education, but also what they need to know to get on these multiple platforms so they can really engage in their child's instruction and support their success as well. So we got to create new platforms and new spaces for families and students.
Well, I'm glad that you talked.
Oh, I think did we lose Naj?
We may have lost Naj, and then we.
Yeah, can you see me now?
We got him back.
Yep. All right.
Almost had to jump in there.
We missed you for a second there, Naj.
I know. All right. So here, I'll do this quickly. A report about LA Unified. On average, 60% of students in LA Unified were active in daily online learning during spring 2020, the closures during spring 2020. Disparities in which students were accessing the district's LMS. How does that change or make the partnerships work pivot on the basis of when you hear statistics like only 60% were involved in some manner of distance learning?
Yeah, first of all, I commend the district for releasing that data, and I'd recommend that other districts follow suit and think about how to release data that shows disparities, particularly in this moment of distance learning. Something that's really important, one, there are students that have not logged in. There are students that we have not connected with, and we have to focus on finding those students in the fall. I know some people are thinking about distance learning, door-to-door work, or other ways and methods that we can track down these families. I think that's important and essential. The other thing I will say that is really important is we have to be better at how we measure student engagement. Right now, most platforms, in LA, a lot of the student engagement tracking is done by Schoology. And there are multiple platforms that families and teachers are using, whether it be Google Classroom and others. So we have to make sure we have sophisticated ways to measure student engagement. And also, it can't just be logging in, whether a student logs in for a minute or an hour. We also have to measure how uploading assignments, all those things that are important. But clearly, equity gaps are being exacerbated at this time. And if we're not thinking about how we get more resources to the high need schools that need it the most, to the marginalized students who will even be more marginalized because of this crisis, then we're not really thinking about issues of equity. So I've heard a lot of school leaders talk about, we got to get all of our students everything. I think that's important. But I do think the district needs to pull up and think about how we get the highest need communities what they need as quick as possible, because we know the need is greater for some communities compared to other communities.
And so those of you that saw in the background, my daughter, I guess, was tired of being upstaged by Nico. So
you know what's funny about that is my daughter is actually sitting right over here. And if I ask her to come on, she'll be like, no,
full teenage mode there.
They're stars. I can't be a parent advocate and not allow your to join us today.
Exactly.
So speaking of parents, Ryan, so I know it feels like over the last couple of weeks, all of our efforts went, and rightly so, concentrating on how we can make distance learning the best it possibly can be, right? Even while acknowledging that it's never going to fully replace what we have in in-person instruction. I know one of the concerns that we've heard around from some of our members, just given everything that we're talking about, these fights we're even having on these waivers, but then broadly on some of the guidance of how is it that we're going to be able to transition from distance learning to back to in-person instruction. That obviously the health situation, but then also getting some of the buy-in from our employees, from our broader community. I mean, what is this conversation looking like in your set of schools in Los Angeles? It's so we're so immersed in distance learning now, but we also have to have the long game in view about how do we at some point transition back out of that.
Yeah, I think those aren't mutually exclusive. We have to have those conversations at the same time. I think it's going to be really important moving forward that we think about how to transition safely, and I'm glad we're all having that conversation. But we also have to know, like I know that Saul Khan of the Khan Academy, who's considered the guru of thinking about remote learning, says it doesn't replace in-person instruction. And I think that's true. I do think at some point, particularly for special education students, particularly for English learners, particularly for groups that have oftentimes not received everything that they needed in order to be successful, we do have to think what type of hybrid model may support their success. And clearly think about safety there, but we do not want to see a year of learning loss. I know that we were building the plane, some of us, while we were flying in the spring. We've learned a lot for the fall, but we will have to start thinking long term. If it's hybrid, if it's pods, if it's thinking a little bit differently about how we provide instruction, clearly we have to meet the need of quality instruction for all students. Meeting the basic need of students and not providing them every opportunity to learn is not enough, particularly when we're talking about closing equity gaps. Let's just make sure that we're having the vibrant conversation about how we support quality instruction as well, while we're providing safety.
And of course, we want to invite our viewers to jump in, say hello, toss in any questions. Ryan, you mentioned courageous conversations. You mentioned your participation in Black Lives Matter's marches, and then the students participating as well. And I want to hit on social issues because I hear from educators, they are expressing a desire to talk about social issues, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, but there is some hesitancy to go ahead and do that because there's no curriculum, because it could be a political football, because they may not have that support from their education leaders. Let me ask you from your lens, there must be a need for curriculum, but how do we go about developing that? And then what is the role for school leaders in supporting that type of discussion on campuses in school districts?
Well, I'm excited we're having a really good conversation at the state level about ethnic studies, whether that be in higher ed, whether that be in K-12, and thinking differently about how we make sure we're teaching students affirming curriculum that affirms who they are, their self-value, and their communities. That's important. I don't think we can't wait until a curricula is developed in order to have these conversations. So I think curriculum is important. I do think we need to create space to have conversations about how race and class impact our work, both with our colleagues. So Glenn Singleton does a lot of work around courageous conversations, and he talks about experienced discomfort. He talks about speaking the truth. He talks about things may feel unsettled, but at least you've had the conversation. In this window where all systems are being looked at as how they deal with racial disparities, we cannot sidestep that in education. The other thing I'll just say that I think is really important is if we're thinking about how we support Black students, Latinx students, and English learners, I do think there has to be a conversation about, in a resource-constrained environment, which may happen, what resources are we willing to make sure are there to support their success, particularly the students who, if we have to make cuts, those cuts will hurt, in particular for those populations. So before we have to make drastic cuts, let's talk about what we need to do in order to keep those services whole for those students. I think all of that really matters. So I'm hoping ACSA is having unapologetic conversations around race and class. I know that this is important to Wes. I hope that leaders are following suit, because if there's ever an opportunity to do it, now is that time.
Ryan, you mentioned about those supports and those needs of our students. Gary, one of our viewers, asked, how do we maximize the support for social emotional well-being, even while we're in distance learning, even while we have some of these constraints? How do we still make sure that those needs are being met?
Yeah, so I actually think we have to double down on that. So there's a couple grounding principles that we've created at the partnership when we think about social emotional learning that's going to be really powerful for us. So when we think about connection and social emotional learning, our teachers are implementing daily essential 3 for SEL instruction and all synchronous learning experience. They're greeting students and check in about how they're feeling. They're ensuring there's time for student interaction, and then they have an uplifting ending to class. And teachers are ensuring that happens at least weekly. So as we think about professional development, as we start planning for the year, how are we embedding social emotional learning in every opportunity that we have with students? And then how are we making sure that we're actually talking to our students, we're focus grouping and we're surveying them in order to see if we're meeting their social emotional needs as well. So connection to SEL is going to be really important. I also think we have an opportunity in distance learning to think about how just learning differently. Unfortunately, we still measure learning from how many minutes a student's in a seat, and we know that's never been sufficient. This is the opportunity to actually think about competency-based education, to think about project-based learning, other opportunities that provide different types of assessments so that we know that our students are moving forward and are actually learning the content. So, while there are a lot of challenges, this may provide an opportunity to strengthen our relationships and strengthen social emotional supports.
And Ryan, Michelle Hatchford has a question. It's a long question, so I'll just give you the second half of it. What she's saying is, I would offer thinking about the needs of those families who have a challenge with daily in-person schooling. And that is certainly a concern, not just in some schools, but all schools, about being able to have that distance learning, that in-person distance learning. Is that something that you guys are going to have to confront, not just in those 19 schools, but everywhere in Los Angeles and everywhere in the States?
I think so. I think there are challenges that parents are actually having going online. We just released a equity alert that showed that even within our network in Borough Heights, Watson, South LA, 16% in March were disconnected or underconnected to the internet. So we do have to grapple with that. I think that is really important and essential. And we collected some data that showed that a lot of families who are experiencing challenges getting online, they're relying on siblings, even more than teachers, even more than parents. Younger siblings are relying on older siblings to actually get online and to do their work. Well, if you don't have siblings, if you don't have somebody who's technologically savvy, how are you really engaging in the content? I think that's really important. But does this present an opportunity to double down on the schools that really need this type of support the most? I think so. So I would encourage us to continue to have a laser-like focus on equity in this moment.
And there's that link right there for those of you who want to look at that report for the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. Ryan, I was just thinking that every time I see you, you're in a jacket. And right now you're in a t-shirt. So I'm wondering, what have you been doing during this pandemic that is different than the normal jacket and slacks and tie Ryan Smith that I normally see?
I was wondering, I said, I wonder if they're going to get dressed up. I should have known, hanging out with the ACSA crew, that there will always be a collared shirt, even in the middle of a pandemic. So forgive me for coming underdressed to the party. Look, so I did a virtual book club on Coates, The Water Dancer, which I loved. I have been learning new recipes, which I've not loved as much. I've had to go to nature, although I'm a city guy, which I have not loved as much, just to leave my house. But I've also been just figuring out other ways to stay engaged. It feels like this is this day 3042 of the pandemic?
Yeah.
I've been accurately counting time. But hopefully in 2021, we'll have some opportunities to maybe leave my house. But until then, I'll keep reading and keep cooking.
Equity champion from the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, Ryan Smith. Ryan, it's been an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much. And don't be surprised if we come to you again as the school year starts up.
I appreciate that. And the next time you do this, I want to see your beautiful children actually anchoring lunch break.
They will get here pretty soon.
Yeah, and see if anybody recognizes the difference. No,
there you go. See?
I think Family Day, and I'll bring my family as well. I appreciate you guys. Continue to do the good fight.
Thanks, Ryan, very much. Appreciate it. Edgar, as we make our way to the bottom of the hour here, I just want to get maybe a couple of more details from you. On the waivers, because I think that there's still a lot of questions out there, but maybe just a little more clarification, because I know that you continue to have information that's coming to you.
Yeah, I think the big pieces, things that we talked about in previous weeks is one, we got a number of questions last week and the week before. What about small groups? What if I want to bring in groups of special ed students, English learners, other targeted students that may not do as well with distance learning? And the answer we've gotten from the state, and they referenced this in their FAQs in their guidance this week, is that they do deem that to be permissible. They didn't give us a clear answer on what you have to do to get approval for that. They did make a distinction that the waiver process we're talking about now for elementary schools, that's not intended to be the process that you use if you're trying to bring in small groups of students for targeted instruction. The guidance does say that more information will be forthcoming. I know that's a challenge because we're starting the school year in many cases this week, next week, but the state is telling us that we'll have more to hear on that end. And then lastly, I know we had a big show on sports a few weeks back. There is now official guidance for youth sports from CDPH. Nothing groundbreaking there other than does clarify that youth conditioning is allowed right now in counties. There are some restrictions on indoor sports depending what county you're in, and it tries to be in concert with some of the guidelines we received from CIF a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much out there, and you are correct in that some of the schools are starting up, and there's going to be a ton more information. Come here. See, I brought a child down a little bit. Look at that.
I love the Hamilton shirt. I love that.
my 13-year-old Lily is here in our studio helping out her mother prepare for school, which starts next week here in Elk Grove. My 4-year-old
is kind of trying to be in the picture there in the background.
See, there you go. A couple of soccer players that are not necessarily, well, at least this one is not necessarily happy about being on, but your daughter keeps waving.
Yeah.
In full screen.
Exactly.
All right, Edgar, good to see you, man. There's going to be plenty of information I know of come next week, so we'll have plenty to talk about. Good seeing you. Go eat lunch, and we'll talk next week.
See you next week, Naj.
All right. Thank you, folks, so much for being with us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Remember, we are back here next Wednesday at 1 p.m. live and interactive for you. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next week.